Hello everyone, my name is Hajar Lafta, and the focus of this portion of the training is to apply the information we have learned to creating a trauma-informed classroom. Here's a video from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that goes over some trauma-informed strategies that a school used that eventually helped them improve their graduation rate.
Since the beginning of the Breakthrough Series Collaborative, we have been working at Woodward very hard to build a sense of community in our students and in our building so that the students, when they come to school, know that Woodward is a safe place to be and that they have people at Woodward who truly care about them in our staff as well as the other students. The way that we have tried to do this year is by creating what we call a polar vortex, because our mascot is a polar bear. And the polar vortex is a collaboration between the principal and myself and a team of about 10 core students who help to plan activities for the building. Since we have started the Breakthrough Collaborative series, we will definitely continue these things next year because it has had a very positive impact on our building.
I would say the other thing you see differently here is every kid is greeted as they walk in the door. And that starts when kids walk in the front door and then at the threshold of the classroom. But it comes back to the intentional practice. We did some really small professional development, really just kind of showing some video footage of other schools and ideas that they were using around doorway greetings and calm corners. And so if you walk around our building, you'll notice that most teachers are doing some kind of a doorway greeting, even though it doesn't look exactly the same at the threshold of every classroom.
We started EWIMS last year with our 9th grade repeaters, so kids who were credit deficient, and realized that the percentage of failures in 9th grade were exactly the same as our graduation rate. And so if we caught them early with impactful strategies, we thought we could change our graduation rate and get kids back on track. We put a team of about 20 teachers together. Each teacher is assigned about 3 or 4 students that they mentor. So they meet with them, check on their attendance, check on their grades. We just implemented a goal sheet where you kind of can see where the kid is headed, what they really want out of things. And last year was really successful. We got about 11 kids back on track out of 42 that we focused on. We realized our seniors were in dire need of some support. So roughly around this time last year, we put together a Save the Senior group. Check on them, make sure their credit recovery is good, their attendance is good, things like that are happening. And we saved 82% of our kids in danger of not graduating last year.
I think the focus that we have communicated to staff about this work is that we're really looking at how we're responding to students. And I think that is the biggest impact on that defiance and insubordination type behavior is it's how we respond to them in those moments.
Really, when it comes down to it, our goal is to make children that feel safe and willing to take risk and to, in the long run, to become a productive part of society. But in reality, these kids come with so much that's attached to them that we can't control. You can't try to get through the curriculum and deal with the problems that our students have. You just can't. I mean, you do the best that you can and the train has to keep moving, but you gotta work with these kids individually. I mean, I'm here after school 3 days a week trying to get kids caught up and trying to teach them things and before school and other things. It takes a lot of work, but to be honest, I'm trying to get these kids to learn something and to feel accomplished, even if it's a small thing that they do.
However, trauma doesn't always create traumatization. So we can't say just because a child has gone through this experience, that means they will be traumatized. So children can experience events and react in very different ways. And a good metaphor for why some children are resilient is a bowling alley. So if we go bowling, we have those bumpers along the side that can keep the ball out of the gutter. And those can be thought of as buffers. So buffers can help us contextualize those traumatizing experiences and process them and cope with them. So that can include support and relationships from family, friends, community, can include a spiritual community. So all of those things can kind of help, in addition to internal resilience and access to coping skills that can help manage stress. So the greater our buffers, the less likely we will experience traumatization. And ultimately, the trauma response depends on the severity of the stressor and whether or not it's repeated and how early in life these stressors occur. So in the next part, we're going to really focus on students who have developed that kind of trauma response and the brain development issues that can result. And, talk about how we can help those students. However, there are strategies we can adopt that will help all students. Because at some point, all students get stressed out, all students get overwhelmed. So ultimately, trauma-informed care is care that recognizes that trauma changes the brain and that these neurological changes affect every area of the student's life, whether that's sensory issues, relationships, emotion regulation, executive functioning, memory, behavior, and learning. And these are all things that we see in school. These are all things that affect how well a student is going to do in school. So what do we need to do? Firstly, we need to recognize that techniques that are widely used are sometimes not effective or as effective when a child has a history of trauma. We want to understand that for students to learn, the trauma must be kept in mind. We need to know that a student can learn many things and needs to learn many things before they can learn academics. So we need to make sure that the amygdala and the hippocampus are taken care of before we expect them to use their prefrontal cortex. We need to focus on relationships because that's ultimately the way that trauma is healed, is through relationships. And we'll talk a lot more about that in part 2. And we need to understand that managing behavior is not enough. So these are things that we can do that will help everybody. And again, we don't need to know which children have gone through what in order to do these things. So first and foremost, we want to create safety. And consistency is about routines and predictable expectations. And sometimes students with trauma histories will need more practice and exposure to these routines in order to see them as predictable. And we don't want to expect them to shut down their stress system and access their thinking brains when they're hungry, thirsty, or tired. So we want to meet basic and physical needs, Maslow's. We need to connect to the student and regulate the student. So a secure connection with the student is most likely to be developed if we have large amounts of positive interactions coupled with boundaries. And we may need to regulate the student and be prepared to de-escalate. So we want to connect to the student before we correct the student and communicate acceptance and not reinforce those feelings of shame that the trauma can cause, because we don't want to, again, build on those things. We want to teach new things and show that things can be different. So at the end of the day, we want to realize that the primary lessons the child needs to learn at the moment are that they are safe and that they are cared for. And the other lessons can wait until the child is ready to learn them. So in part 2, we'll talk a little bit more about behavior and specific things that we can try in the classroom to help support both students with trauma and all students. I'll see you in part 2. Hello, and welcome to part 2 of Trauma Resilient Classrooms. So we are all used to the fight or flight or fight, flight, or freeze model of how people respond to stress. But Dr. Stephanie Grant provides a different model that can help us kind of see where a student is at and track their state of escalation. So on this chart, you can see the first stage is calm, and that means the student is ready to learn. So at this stage, there's not really much stress going on. The second stage is alert, which means there's a mild stress. And I would argue that all of our students will at least start here on the scale in the fall, because if we're coming back into the building, there's going to be a whole new system to get used to. And there will be at least mild stress for everyone. And sometimes this is a teachable moment. If a student can manage their stress here, that can be a good thing because they learn how to use those coping skills and how to de-escalate. The third stage is alarm. This is when a student is clearly anxious, distracted, or otherwise preoccupied. And here a student is spending a lot of energy already on managing stress, and learning is already impaired. And children with trauma often start the day here. They're already escalated before they even walk into the door. So here we want to focus on co-regulating. And co-regulating basically just means we coach through the regulation of emotions. We're supportive, we model, we accept feelings, we listen, and we help the child feel understood. The fourth stage is fear. There's little capacity for thinking at this point, and de-escalation needs to be calm, slow, and deliberate. So we can't tell a student to calm down and expect it to happen immediately. It will take time. And the fifth stage is what Stephanie Grant calls terror. So this is when a student is in survival mode. There's loss of control. You may see aggressive and destructive behaviors instead of just disruptive behaviors. Or you may see a student dissociate, shut down, withdraw, and avoid. So we want to offer food or drink. We want to stay close, not leave the child alone. And we want to have a plan for how to address unsafe behaviors and a plan to resume learning. So co-regulation can look like different things. It can look like, maybe you guide the whole class through a mindfulness exercise as a brain break. It may be having the class work on an activity while you have a chat with that student and find a way to get back to learning. So it can look like identifying a student's emotions or trying to, or observing what's going on. So saying, hey, it looks like you're feeling really overwhelmed right now. What do you want to choose to do to help feel better in the moment so we can get back to learning? So kind of just modeling, observing, and supporting a student through this experience. So all behavior meets a need. And there are 4 general categories of behaviors that we can kind of look at and see where the behavior fits in, what need it is trying to meet. So the first category is sensory, which basically just means a behavior that provides a preferred sensory input, something that feels nice. And it can happen anytime, but especially when someone is already overwhelmed or anxious. And this can be doodling, nail biting, using a fidget spinner. And basically, if that provides a satisfying input, that reinforces that behavior and that behavior will continue. The second category is an escape behavior. So this is where our avoidance behaviors live. So this can be leaving the room, looking at a phone, and escape behaviors can happen when we want to avoid an unpleasant activity, either because it's boring, too hard, or too scary. And you have to remember that children with trauma can experience difficult tasks or assignments as threatening. If our threat response is on overdrive, something that's going to cause shame or embarrassment to me is going to be threatening, and I'm going to try to avoid it if I don't like that feeling. The third category is attention or connection-seeking behavior. Sometimes attention-seeking behavior has a negative connotation, but we're all hardwired to seek attention. We're evolved for it. So typically in the classroom, this might look like disruptive behavior. And that means pay attention to me or listen to me. And the attention doesn't have to be positive. A lot of times children learn that the attention that they're going to get is negative at home. And so the acting out in order to get a response, even if it's yelling, that is still a form of attention. And so we have to be mindful that sometimes, even though it feels like a student is out to annoy us, I know we've all had that thought before, but it's really connection-seeking behavior. And it's not necessarily a conscious process. It's not personal. It's just the seeking of that connection that manifests itself in a way that might be frustrating to us. And the fourth category is tangibles. So this is behavior that seeks preferred items or activities. So this typically looks like escalating behavior due to a punishment to try and get the item or preferred activity back. So the classic example is a temper tantrum. So if you scream loud enough, hopefully you'll get the iPad back. And then if you do, that reinforces that behavior. And this might also be what we would label as manipulation when it's a behavior related to tangibles, even though, again, it's not necessarily a conscious process. So, for example, a phone may fill each of these needs. It can be a sensory experience if I'm playing a game with lots of lights and sounds. It can be an escape if I'm trying to avoid something. It can be a way to seek connection with other people, and it's a tangible item. So each of these areas, or each behavior and the need it's trying to meet, are context and student dependent. A student can engage in multiple different behaviors for the same reason, or the same behavior multiple times in a day for different reasons. And students with trauma are often in a state of arousal where their prefrontal cortex just isn't functioning the way it would if they were calm. And they may not be able to verbally communicate what's going on. So this is why looking at behavior and its function is really important, because it might be the only thing we have to tell us what's going on with the student. So behavior problems, behavior in general, is a form of communication. So there are different kinds of behaviors we might see, and we need to think about what that's communicating to us and how we support changing that behavior. So defiance. Defiance, generally speaking, communicates fear, mistrust, or a need to control their own actions. And this can happen even if we have done nothing to limit control. However, if it's our natural plan to move on to the next assignment, and that's perceived as a limit of control, that can cause defiance, even if it's not our intention. And we have to remember that children with trauma, again, have that fear response on overdrive and that need to protect themselves from harm or from threats. And so when we are faced with defiance, it's really important to offer choices and avoid those power struggles while trying not to reinforce the defiant behavior. And that can be difficult. The second category is what we would label manipulation, which is any behavior that's an attempt to get a need met that we maybe don't like or that we take personally. So we want to suspend judgment and think about what is the behavior trying to obtain, and how can we teach different or more adaptive behaviors to get the same result. Anxiety communicates fear or terror. So we want to provide structure and clear expectations to bring that anxiety down. And the next three categories, which are inattentiveness, noncompliance, and time management issues, this also includes hyperactivity, communicates distraction with threatening stimuli, readiness to face threats, or surviving the now. So oftentimes students with trauma are just focused on the moment, and that can lead to a lot of issues with working memory, specifically related to toxic stress. And this can be very frustrating because it might appear that a student functions really well in other areas and they just don't get the instructions, or you have to repeat yourself so many times, and that can be very frustrating. But we need to remember that this is a product of toxic stress. It's not necessarily intentional. So what helps with these things are a calming classroom environment and frequent breaks, and using external visuals and reminders at all levels, even in secondary. And we have to remember that trauma affects development. And so developmentally, we may expect, especially our secondary students who have experienced trauma, to function at a certain level. And they may still need some of those reminders or some of those tools. So we want to use a new lens. We want to move from what consequences do we give to what do we teach the student in the moment. So we cannot mentally process anything until we calm down. And again, sometimes with our older students, we expect them to immediately be able to talk to us about the causes of their behavior, the consequences of their behavior. And again, we're expecting them to use a part of their brain that sometimes is in shutdown mode when they're really in a state of arousal like terror or fear. And this may be the first time that we are teaching them this, or that they're even learning this in a school environment. So ultimately, we need to restore that feeling of safety and model regulating stress. And we can help the student examine what triggered or caused the behavior later and what the consequences were. And we all have that skill as adults, but we need to teach it to kids. And we also need to remember that these behaviors, as frustrating as they may be to us, are adaptive in the context of trauma and in the context of the kid's life. So if a student is avoiding assignments because they're too difficult or scary, that works for them because they don't have to do those assignments. It removes the negative thing. It removes the threats. Whereas our first thought is, oh, this is impacting your education, right? But again, we're not in their shoes. And so we need to change the way we think and use that new lens to understand where they're coming from. So teachers are busy. We don't want you to have to become psychologists and behavior analysts, right? And behaviors can be really complex and multifaceted and difficult to figure out. However, the goal is to be aware of these things in the back of our minds so that we can work as a team to help each of our students be successful. And as a teacher, you are critical to this. And any staff who spends a lot of time with a student, you are seeing the behaviors happen. You have the most information to help the team figure out how to help this student. And ultimately, trauma is repaired in the context of relationships. If we co-regulate with students, they learn to trust adults. Trauma teaches us that the world isn't safe. So if we learn that some places are safe, we will then learn that our fear response doesn't have to be on overdrive all the time. And then once they learn that they can have their needs met, that's when they can learn and grow and do all of the wonderful things that we want them to do, and learn new behaviors that will help them in other settings in addition to school. These are life lessons. So, if you would like to learn more about how to support students with trauma after completing this module, please reach out to your school social worker, school psychologist, or myself, Lynn Serhone. And I hope you enjoyed this training. I hope it was useful to you, and hopefully it's the first of many. So again, if you have any questions, please reach out. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the SEL modules and that you have a great day.
In considering these basic principles of creating trauma-informed environments, trauma-informed classrooms, and building youth resilience, we employed them in the creation of MI-LEAP. We made adaptations to the Michigan Model for Health curriculum with the understanding that traditional techniques for engagement and program delivery may not work for youth exposed to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Safety is a priority, as this is needed before students can learn about academics. Our focus is on building important skills and positive relationships as a foundation. We made adaptations to reduce the likelihood of inadvertent triggering and re-traumatization and emphasize the specific skill building already in Michigan Model for Health that is especially pertinent to trauma-informed environments, such as coping strategies. In the next few segments, you will learn more about our overarching approach to adapting Michigan Model for Health and specific adaptations in the MI-LEAP units.